The works. Chapter 1. Of writing lives in general, and particularly of Pamela with the word by the by of Caliciba and others. It is a trite but true observation, that examples work more forcibly on the mind than precepts, and if this be just in what is odious and blamable, it is more strongly so in what is amiable and praiseworthy. Here emulation most effectually operates upon us, and inspires our imitation in an irresistible manner. A good man therefore is a standing lesson to all his acquaintance, and of far greater use in that narrow circle than a good book. But as it often happens that the best men are but little known, and consequently cannot extend the usefulness of their examples a great way, the writer may be called in aid to spread their history farther, and to present the amiable pictures to those who have not the happiness of knowing the originals, and so, by communicating such valuable patterns to the world, he may perhaps do a more extensive service to mankind than the person whose life originally afforded the pattern. In this light I have always regarded those biographers who have recorded the actions of great and worthy persons of both sexes. Not to mention those ancient writers which of late days a little read, being written in obsolete, and as they are generally thought, unintelligible languages, such as Plutarch, Nepos, and others which I heard of in my youth. Our own language affords many of excellent use and instruction, finely calculated to sow the seeds of virtue in youth, and very easy to be comprehended by persons of moderate capacity. Such as the history of John the Great, who, by his brave and heroic actions against men of large and athletic bodies, obtained the glorious appellation of the giant killer. That of an Earl of Warwick, whose Christian name was Guy. The lives of Argalus and Parthenia, and above all, the history of those 7 worthy personages, the champions of Christendom. In all these delight is mixed with instruction, and the reader is almost as much improved as entertained. But I pass by these and many others to mention 2 books lately published, which represent an admirable pattern of the amiable in either sex. The former of these, which deals in male virtue, was written by the great person himself, who lived the life he hath recorded, and is by many thought to have lived such a life only in order to write it. The other is communicated to us by an historian who borrows his lights, as the common method is, from authentic papers and records. The reader, I believe, already conjectures, I mean the lives of Mr. Caliciba and of Mrs. Pamela Andrews. How artfully doth the former, by insinuating that he escaped being promoted to the highest stations in church and state, teach us a contempt of worldly grandeur. How strongly doth he inculcate an absolute submission to our superiors. Lastly, how completely doth he arm us against so uneasy, so wretched a passion as the fear of shame. How clearly doth he expose the emptiness and vanity of that phantom, reputation. What the female readers are taught by the memoirs of Mrs. Andrews is so well set forth in the excellent essays or letters prefixed to the second and subsequent editions of that work, that it would be here a needless repetition. The authentic history with which I now present the public is an instance of the great good that book is likely to do, and of the prevalence of example which I have just observed, since it will appear that it was by keeping the excellent pattern of his sister's virtues before his eyes, that Mr. Joseph Andrews was chiefly enabled to preserve his purity in the midst of such great temptations. I shall only add that this character of male chastity, though doubtless as desirable and becoming in one part of the human species as in the other, is almost the only virtue which the great apologist hath not given himself for the sake of giving the example to his readers. Chapter 2 Of Mr. Joseph Andrews, his birth, parentage, education, and great endowments, with a word or two concerning ancestors. Mr. Joseph Andrews, the hero of our ensuing history, was esteemed to be the only son of Gaffer and Gammer Andrews, and brother to the illustrious Pamela, whose virtue is at present so famous. As to his ancestors, we have searched with great diligence, but little success, being unable to trace them farther than his great-grandfather, who, as an elderly person in the parish remembers to have heard his father say, was an excellent cudgel player. Whether he had any ancestors before this, we must leave to the opinion of our curious reader, finding nothing of sufficient certainty to rely on. However, we cannot omit inserting an epitaph which an ingenious friend of ours hath communicated, Stay, traveller, for underneath this pew lies fast asleep that merry man Andrew. When the last day's great sun shall gild the skies, then he shall from his tomb get up and rise. Be merry while thou canst, for surely thou shalt shortly be as sad as he is now. The words are almost out of the stone with antiquity. But it is needless to observe that Andrew here is writ without an S, and is, besides, a Christian name. My friend, moreover, conjectures this to have been the founder of that sect of laughing philosophers since called Merry Andrews. To waive, therefore, a circumstance which, though mentioned in conformity to the exact rules of biography, is not greatly material, I proceed to things of more consequence. Indeed, it is sufficiently certain that he had as many ancestors as the best man living, and, perhaps, if we look 500 or 600 years backwards, might be related to some persons of very great figure at present, whose ancestors within half the last century are buried in as great obscurity. But suppose, for argument's sake, we should admit that he had no ancestors at all, but had sprung up, according to the modern phrase, out of a dunghill, as the Athenians pretended they themselves did from the earth, would not this autocoprose have been justly entitled to all the praise arising from his own virtues? Would it not be hard that a man who hath no ancestors should therefore be rendered incapable of acquiring honour, when we see so many who have no virtues enjoying the honour of their forefathers? At 10 years old, by which time his education was advanced to writing and reading, he was bound an apprentice, according to the statute, to Sir Thomas Booby, an uncle of Mr. Booby's by the father's side. Sir Thomas having then an estate in his own hands, the young Andrews was at first employed in what in the country they call keeping birds. His office was to perform the part the ancients assigned to the god Priapus, which deity the moderns call by the name of Jack-o'-lantern. But his voice being so extremely musical, that it rather allured the birds than terrified them, he was soon transplanted from the fields into the dog kennel, where he was placed under the huntsman, and made what the sportsmen term whipper-in. For this place likewise the sweetness of his voice disqualified him, the dogs preferring the melody of his chiding to all the alluring notes of the huntsman, who soon became so incensed at it, that he desired Sir Thomas to provide otherwise for him, and constantly laid every fault the dogs were at to the account of the poor boy, who was now transplanted to the stable. Here he soon gave proofs of strength and agility beyond his years, and constantly rode the most spirited and vicious horses to water, with an intrepidity which surprised every one. While he was in this station, he rode several races for Sir Thomas, and this with such expertness and success, that the neighbouring gentlemen frequently solicited the knight to permit little Joey, for so he was called, to ride their matches. The best gamesters, before they laid their money, always inquired which horse little Joey was to ride, and the bets were rather proportioned by the rider than by the horse himself, especially after he had scornfully refused a considerable bribe to play booty on such an occasion. This extremely raised his character, and so pleased the Lady Booby, that she desired to have him, being now 17 years of age, for her own footboy. Joey was now preferred from the stable to attend on his lady, to go on her errands, stand behind her chair, wait at her tea table, and carry her prayer book to church, at which place his voice gave him an opportunity of distinguishing himself by singing psalms. He behaved likewise in every other respect so well at divine service, that it recommended him to the notice of Mr. Abraham Adams, the curate, who took an opportunity one day, as he was drinking a cup of ale in Sir Thomas's kitchen, to ask the young man several questions concerning religion, with his answers to which he was wonderfully pleased. Chapter 3 Of Mr. Abraham Adams the curate, Mrs. Slipslop the chambermaid, and others. Mr. Abraham Adams was an excellent scholar. He was a perfect master of the Greek and Latin languages, to which he added a great share of knowledge in the Oriental tongues, and could read and translate French, Italian, and Spanish. He had applied many years to the most severe study, and had treasured up a fund of learning rarely to be met with in a university. He was, besides, a man of good sense, good parts, and good nature, but was at the same time as entirely ignorant of the ways of this world as an infant just entered into it could possibly be. As he had never any intention to deceive, so he never suspected such a design in others. He was generous, friendly, and brave to an excess, but simplicity was his characteristic. He did, no more than Mr. Caliciber, apprehend any such passions as malice and envy to exist in mankind, which was indeed less remarkable in a country parson than in a gentleman who hath passed his life behind the scenes, a place which hath been seldom thought the school of innocence, and where a very little observation would have convinced the great apologist that those passions have a real existence in the human mind. His virtue, and his other qualifications, as they rendered him equal to his office, so they made him an agreeable and valuable companion, and had so much endeared and well recommended him to a bishop, that at the age of 50 he was provided with a handsome income of £23 a year, which, however, he could not make any great figure with, because he lived in a dear country, and was a little encumbered with a wife and 6 children. It was this gentleman, who having, as I have said, observed the singular devotion of young Andrews, had found means to question him concerning several particulars, as, how many books there were in the New Testament, which were they, how many chapters they contained, and such like, to all which, Mr. Adams privately said, he answered much better than Sir Thomas, or 2 other neighbouring justices of the peace could probably have done. Mr. Adams was wonderfully solicitous to know at what time, and by what opportunity, the youth became acquainted with these matters. Joey told him that he had very early learned to read and write by the goodness of his father, who, though he had not interest enough to get him into a charity school, because a cousin of his father's landlord did not vote on the right side for a churchwarden in a borough town, yet had been himself at the expense of 6 a week for his learning. He told him likewise, that ever since he was in Sir Thomas's family he had employed all his hours of leisure in reading good books, that he had read the Bible, the whole duty of man, and Thomas à Kempis, and that as often as he could, without being perceived, he had studied a great good book which lay open in the hall window, where he had read, as how the devil carried away half a church in sermon time, without hurting one of the congregation, and as how a field of corn ran away down a hill with all the trees upon it, and covered another man's meadow. This sufficiently assured Mr. Adams that the good book meant could be no other than Baker's Chronicle. The curate, surprised to find such instances of industry and application in a young man who had never met with the least encouragement, asked him, if he did not extremely regret the want of a liberal education, and the not having been born of parents who might have indulged his talents and desire of knowledge? To which he answered, he hoped he had profited somewhat better from the books he had read than to lament his condition in this world. That, for his part, he was perfectly content with the state to which he was called, that he should endeavour to improve his talent, which was all required of him, but not repine at his own lot, nor envy those of his betters. Well said, my lad, replied the curate, and I wish some who have read many more good books, nay, and some who have written good books themselves, had profited so much by them. Adams had no nearer access to Sir Thomas or my lady than through the waiting gentlewoman, for Sir Thomas was too apt to estimate men merely by their dress or fortune, and my lady was a woman of gaiety, who had been blessed with a town education, and never spoke of any of her country neighbours by any other appellation than that of the brutes. They both regarded the curate as a kind of domestic only, belonging to the parson of the parish, who was at this time at variance with the knight, for the parson had for many years lived in a constant state of civil war, or, which is perhaps as bad, of civil law, with Sir Thomas himself and the tenants of his manor. The foundation of this quarrel was a modus, by setting which aside an advantage of several shillings per annum would have accrued to the rector, but he had not yet been able to accomplish his purpose, and had reaped hitherto nothing better from the suits than the pleasure, which he used indeed frequently to say was no small one, of reflecting that he had utterly undone many of the poor tenants, though he had at the same time greatly impoverished himself. Mrs. Slip-Slop, the waiting gentlewoman, being herself the daughter of a curate, preserved some respect for Adams. She professed great regard for his learning, and would frequently dispute with him on points of theology, but always insisted on a deference to be paid to her understanding, as she had been frequently at London, and knew more of the world than a country parson could pretend to. She had in these disputes a particular advantage over Adams, for she was a mighty affecter of hard words, which she used in such a manner that the parson, who durst not offend her by calling her words in question, was frequently at some loss to guess her meaning, and would have been much less puzzled by an Arabian manuscript. Adams therefore took an opportunity one day, after a pretty long discourse with her on the essence, or, as she pleased to term it, the incense, of matter, to mention the case of young Andrews, desiring her to recommend him to her lady as a youth very susceptible of learning, and one whose instruction in Latin he would himself undertake, by which means he might be qualified for a higher station than that of a footman, and added, she knew it was in his master's power easily to provide for him in a better manner. He therefore desired that the boy might be left behind under his care. La. Mr. Adams, said Mrs. Slip-Slop, do you think my lady will suffer any preambles about any such matter? She is going to London very concisely, and I am confident would not leave Joey behind her on any account, for he is one of the genteelest young fellows you may see in a summer's day, and I am confident she would as soon think of parting with a pair of her grey mares, for she values herself as much on one as the other. Adams would have interrupted, but she proceeded, and why is Latin more necessitous for a footman than a gentleman? It is very proper that you clergymen must learn it, because you can't preach without it, but I have heard gentlemen say in London, that it is fit for nobody else. I am confident my lady would be angry with me for mentioning it, and I shall draw myself into no such dilemma. At which words her lady's bell rung, and Mr. Adams was forced to retire, nor could he gain a second opportunity with her before their London journey, which happened a few days afterwards. However, Andrews behaved very thankfully and gratefully to him for his intended kindness, which he told him he never would forget, and at the same time received from the good man many admonitions concerning the regulation of his future conduct, and his perseverance in innocence and industry.